guia de estilo e instruções para a síntese de fala. Este é o início da mensagem. Comece com energia total e um tom de comando, capturando a atenção imediatamente. The clinic smelled of sandalwood and lemon rind, the scent braided through low, steady flute notes that Sophia had learned to play softly between patients. Her hands were warm and steady when she placed them above the woman's ribs. She felt the familiar thrum under skin and bone, a private weather of tension and release. 15 years of practice had taught her to notice the small discrepancies first. A hesitation in a breath, a tremor of color under the eyes, the way a client's fingers involuntarily reached for a ring they had not remembered wearing. Tonight, the anomalies arrived like a new tide. The air itself seemed thicker, a fine pressure that made the little brass chimes on the shelf sing with a duller, closer tone. Her palms began to vibrate before there was any visible sign. She closed her eyes and let the sound of the flute steady her pulse. If you find this story and feel a thrum at the base of your skull as you read, stay with it until the end. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell, and leave a like if this resonates. There are practical steps and resources pinned below that I will reference later. Stay until the end because the guidance matters. There is a 90-day window where simple practices make a difference. Sophia had learned over the years to name what she felt without embellishment. She said quietly to Marcos, who had come that evening more curious than faithful, a friend from graduate school who now worked in systems logistics, "There's an energy here I don't usually meet." He sat on the low couch, coffee cooling in his hands, the practical angles of his face softened by the lamplight. He had been skeptical when she first invited him to witness a session, had joked about placebo effects and the resilience of ritual. Now his eyebrows were knit, his jaw set, in a way that made Sophia think he was collecting facts internally, cataloging anomalies as an engineer would. The first visible sign was a wash of blue-gold light that did not come from any lamp. It pooled mid-air near the head of the patient, not harsh, but like sunlight filtered through a prism. Fractal patterns moved across it, engraving-like filigrees that folded into themselves and then burst outward like a breath. The chimes on the shelf answered with a higher, pure tone. Sophia's palms hummed at roughly the same rate. The frequency she felt in her bones fit a map she had read about long ago. A cluster around what vibrational practitioners sometimes called a 528 Hz class frequency. She did not think of that as hard science in that moment. She felt it as a bridge, a pulse that resonated with a long, quiet part of her chest. The non-audible communication came without words at first. Images and impressions, a compression of meaning that landed like a pebble in still water and sent concentric ripples through her memory. In her mind, she did not hear a voice. She received a geometry, a metallic structure turned in 3 axes, a device engraved with fractal glyphs, emitting a slow heartbeat of light. The impression labeled itself with a name she did not expect: 3 Atlas. The presence was not human-shaped. It held an organizing intelligence that felt both older and more machine-like than anything she knew. She braced herself. Her training told her to keep records, names, times, sensations. So she reached slowly for the notebook she kept by the couch and wrote, in block letters, 3 Atlas. We are the transmitter. We thin the veil. We offer option. Choose the alignment that sustains. The transmission felt like a hand on the back of her neck, intimate, impartial, urgent.
It carried no demand, only a brightness of intent. Sophia breathed in and out to maintain the field she had cultivated for years, and whispered, because that was a habit and a comfort, "Who are you?" Not who, function. We align vectors. We open the possibility. The reply folded meaning into sensation, an image of Earth, then of a lattice of light connecting scattered centers, then a timeline laid across her consciousness like a strip of ribbon. After the night, Marcos would tell others that he had come to be entertained and instead had been witness to something that would change his vocabulary. He asked questions aloud that Sophia found useful and steadying. Is this external or a projection? Are you sure it's not synesthetic, your trained mind connecting disparate stimuli? He said the word comet as a professional hedge, the kind of term that could be used publicly to describe a sudden brightening in orbit. That night, he recorded what he could on his phone, the patterns of light, the jangle of the chimes, the way Sophia's hands died to a coolness at the fingertips and then regained heat. He watched her face and saw faith and fear and a cleanliness of attention he had not seen before. In the days that followed, the story spread like a careful contagion. Local forums caught wind. A mainstream science desk called and asked if there were any spectrographic data. National observatories posted terse, neutral statements about an unclassified luminous object detected in a high Earth trajectory. Language that shifted the public frame away from mystery toward manageable categories. Within the small healing network, Sophia found she was not alone. Messages from other practitioners recorded similar flares of presence or dreams that contained the same fractal glyphs. The pattern was not singular. The emission that produced the contact had not arrived in an instant. Data and diaries showed it had been building for 8 weeks before her clinic's blue gold wash. 8 weeks of subtle increases. Slight insomnia in some, more vivid dreams in others, a higher incidence of gooseflesh and ringing ears recorded in those who paid attention.
As the phenomenon moved into public consciousness, an institutional script began to appear. Statements classified the object in the sky as anomalous luminosity or transient cometary behavior. Internally, sources described decisions to monitor and to frame the narrative in conservative terms to avoid panic. There were discussions about how to treat sudden claims of global perception, whether to pathologize or to contextualize. Sophia watched this unfold and felt 2 emotions braided: relief that the sensor networks noticed, and a deep frustration at the reflex to shrink extraordinary experience into existing bureaucratic categories. Marcos, who had watched channels of official discourse before, said quietly, "They'll call it a comet because comet is something people can understand without changing much." Within her mind, the 3 Atlas transmissions continued, less like announcements and more like invitations. The presence set out an outline of what it could enable and what the near future would bring. The message contained specifics that would anchor her practice and allow her to help others interpret their experiences. It presented a window, a timeline, and an account of capacities that could, if cultivated, be seeded into human networks. Sophia wrote them down in the same deliberate, plain script she used in clinic notes. The 5 activated capacities that the transmitter suggested would become accessible under the influence of the device. She did not write them as prophecy, but as working hypotheses to test and to teach. The 5 activated capacities: amplified healing, precise intuition,
initial telepathy, accelerated manifestation, direct connection with the creative source. She underlined each and slept poorly that night. The transmissions placed the timeline in coarse blocks that felt methodical and, to her, terrifying in their clarity. In her notebook, she transcribed the chronology the way the presence presented it. Weeks 1-3, an increase in somatic symptoms, heightened heart palpitations, vivid dreams, tinnitus-like ringing, unusual synchronicities. These act as early markers and generally resolve with grounding practices. Weeks 4-7, spontaneous manifestations begin. People report moments of unusual healing, intuitive flashes that prove prescient in low-stakes choices, and small acts of accelerated manifestation, such as unexpectedly resolved logistics or sudden reconciliations. Community networks stabilize experiences. Weeks 8-10, peak window. Veil thinning and mass perception increase. In week 10 specifically, a 48-hour maximum emission period occurs, during which collective choice is most potent. Responses within that window have amplified effects. Individual alignment matters more than ever. She added a note in the margin. Emission began 8 weeks prior to my contact. The peak, if the transmission's outline was accurate, would occur roughly 10 weeks after the encounter. That meant a significant period of preparation lay ahead.
Sophia, note T, to treat such specific claims with disciplined curiosity. Her training, her ethical practice, and the safety constraints she held dear prevented her from offering certainty. When people later asked whether these abilities were guaranteed, she replied with the honesty she reserved for clients. Extraordinary experiences could be catalytic, but outcomes varied. There were no shortcuts and no promises. She rang the small bell on her desk to mark her boundaries. This was a practice she used to re-anchor in measurable habits: rest, nutrition, medical consultation. Marcos read the timeline and, for a moment, let himself consider the social weight of a 48-hour communal window. If that's true, he said bluntly, the stories matter. How authorities describe it, how community leaders frame it, that will drive whether people feel empowered or frightened. He had the clear, applied worry of someone who understood how public discourse ripples into action. In the weeks that followed, Sophia began to map practical integration techniques that were safe, low risk, and repeatable. The kind of practices she could teach in a workshop or an online course without jeopardizing anyone's health. She published them in her private list and began to teach them in small groups. The 3 immediate practices she emphasized were concise and grounded. Conscious breath with intention. Sit with feet on the floor. Inhale slowly for a count that feels natural. Imagine drawing light into the chest on the in-breath. Hold briefly and exhale, releasing tension. Repeat for 5 minutes, focusing on the space behind the sternum where the pulse of the present moment lives. Synchronicity journaling. Keep a small notebook taped to your phone or by your bedside. Note coincidences, repeated numbers, vivid dreams, and impressions. Date them and write 1 line about how they felt. Over time, patterns reveal which threads are worth following. Grounding meditation. Stand barefoot if safe, or sit with feet planted. Visualize roots like roots of a tree descending into the earth. Inhale sustenance, exhale excess charge. Finish with a slow stretch and a glass of water. 5 to 10 minutes daily helps stabilize heightened systems. She taught these in the same measured, non-spectacular way she used to teach someone to roll out adhesions in a scar. Small, consistent actions over time.
She cautioned people to maintain medical care and to consult professionals if experiences became overwhelming. If you feel dissociation, severe anxiety, or a break from everyday functioning, she told a small online group, seek mental health support. These practices are complementary. As more witnesses came forward, patterns of public and private response emerged. Physicians and mental health professionals urged caution, but expressed curiosity. Forums populated by both practitioners and amateurs debated the meaning of the 528 Hz class resonance. A number of journalists published cautious pieces that balanced intrigue with demand for empirical confirmation. That coverage helped create a buffering effect against hysteria. At the same time, scripts surfaced that aimed to contain the phenomenon. Repeated reframing as misidentified celestial objects or as mass psychogenic events. Sophia watched with a combination of relief and irritation. She understood the impulse to reduce ambiguity, but she also knew that reductionist frames could turn lived phenomena into clinical footnotes rather than invitations to integration. One evening, while reviewing the patient log and the hurried notes Marcos had made, she received a transmission that carried a different tone, less informational and more invitational. It contained a metaphor that lodged in her chest like a seed, a field with 1,000 tiny seedlings, each one responding to a single rain. The translator of the mental image was clear. The Atlas device would not force a single conversion, but would increase the probability of growth for those prepared to receive water. We do not harvest without consent. We amplify. The field chooses. The feeling that accompanied the thought was not coercive. It carried agency. Sophia felt both gratitude and the ethical weight of responsibility. If these broadcasts indeed increase the chance of capacity surfacing, then how she taught and who she taught mattered. Marcos, scrambling to reconcile his pragmatic tendencies with the anomalous pattern of his observations, began to take on a different role than he had imagined. He used his contacts to trace public notices and compiled timelines of official statements. He was cautious with language when he later described their findings to close colleagues. There's no evidence of malicious intent, he would say, just a conservative system doing its best to avoid mass panic. But what's interesting is the speed at which discourse moves to containment. That tells you how rare things like this are treated socially. He was the one who first suggested framing the device as 3-eye Atlas in conversations that touched formal reports, a shorthand that would let them juxtapose formal data and eyewitness narratives without conflating them. The emergent pattern of elite or institutional response followed an observable arc: initial monitoring, public classification with a neutral term for comfort, internal debates about whether to pathologize claims, and the setting up of countermeasures that were informational rather than kinetic, information control, strategic narrative framing, and the promotion of alternative explanations that dilute extraordinary claims. Sophia felt that naming these likely moves did not turn her into a conspiracy theorist, it made her a planner. She prepared materials that would help people maintain agency in conversations where their experience might be minimized.
The plan included practical outreach and a small e-book that summarized safe practices and pointed readers to professional resources, explicitly labeled as educational and not a substitute for medical or legal advice. That e-book would later be pinned in posts and mentioned in CTAs, but for now it was a promise on a page, a scaffold for the work of the coming weeks. At the edge of that dawn, the sky over the city held a thin band of light that moved too regular to be cloud,
and too irregular to be aircraft. It lent the world a different color for an hour, and people slowed in their routines, eyes raised. The moment felt less like an invasion and more like an invitation to attention. Sophia watched faces and catalogued a dozen small responses. A child laughed and pointed. An elderly man lifted a hand as if to bless. A commuter paused, brow softening. It was easy to imagine the range of institutional responses. Neutralization by classification, containment by pathologizing, or, less likely but possible, an embrace that amplified care. Sophia decided then to keep her work small and fierce, to teach 10 people well, so those 10 could teach 10 more. She collected her notes and, that evening, wrote the 3 practices again, adding a brief note about consent and medical consultation. She closed the notebook and felt, under the noise and the calculus, a steadying sense of purpose. The atlas's presence was no longer a remote curiosity. It had become a responsibility. The coming weeks would show whether the field would germinate or be trampled. She set her intention to be a trustworthy steward, to hold space for evidence and for wonder, and to resist both sensationalism and sensationalism. Outside, in the sky, a thin, slow pulse washed the clouds with a faint blue-gold shimmer. It was too subtle to make headlines, but those who were watching, those who had felt the low hum in their bones, saw it and felt their own readiness shift. The timeline that had once been a strip in her notebook had become a living cadence in neighborhood kitchens and midnight forums and emergency clinic waiting rooms. There was work to do, to teach breathing and journaling and grounding to anyone who asked, to build circles where people could process fear without shame, to document every instance with both curiosity and clinical caution. Sophia closed the clinic door behind her, the lock clicking like a small punctuation mark to the day's work. She breathed intentionally, felt the roots of her feet, and listened for the faint aftersound of the atlas. The transmission had given a window. The world would choose within it, in ways large and small. She turned to Marcos and said simply, "We teach them to come back to their bodies." He nodded, and in the nod she heard an agreement to the kind of patient, community-centered work that would matter most when the signal crescendoed toward the promised 48-hour peak. There would be noise, and there would be disinformation.
There would also be neighbors holding hands in living rooms and clinicians keeping open lines of communication. The atlas had sent its pulse. The question was how people would respond. Sophia felt the gravity of ordinary choices, breathing, documenting, sharing with care, laid against the cosmic image she had once thought unimaginable. The calendar rows she had penciled into her notebook counted down. 10 weeks staged a slow moral test. The sky was quiet for now. Inside her chest, the steady human beat held a promise to care, to teach, and to prepare. She looked up once more at the faint blue-gold streak and let the flute sound softly in her throat, an anchor in the days to come. The world moved forward, and so did they. The first workshop took place in the back room of the clinic, a space that usually smelled of antiseptic and coffee, but that evening carried the softer scent of lemon oil and paper. 10 chairs were arranged in a loose circle.
Sophia had folded a dozen printed consent forms into neat stacks, each one stamped with the clinic's small logo and a line that read plainly, "This is educational support. If you are in crisis, seek emergency care immediately." She had brought the laminated 3-step cards she'd made, the breath anchor, the ground checklist, the journaling prompts, and a thermos of weak tea. Marcos arrived with a box of pens and a low lamp he set in the center so faces would not disappear into the shadow. People came with the kinds of hesitations Sophia had expected. A teacher from a school 2 neighborhoods over, a woman who said she worked nights at a bakery, a man who wore his uncertainty like a thick jacket. 2 of them carried small paperbacks against their chests. One, a young nurse, had tears on the edge of her smile. No one asked what the atlas really was. No one asked whether it was alien or divine. They had, each in their own way, felt the chest pressure and the private reveries that followed it, and they had come because the pressure had not released. Sophia began by asking for introductions, not the names that fit on insurance forms, but the small things that made someone a person in a room. What made you come tonight? She spoke quietly, and the room learned quickly to hold the volume of its life. The teacher said, "I saw my students draw a line in the air and then stand very still." The bakery worker admitted she had not slept since the first visible pulse. "Not like a fever," she said, "like the world tilting under me." The nurse talked about patients who arrived with memories they could not place, older memories of places they had never been, a new vocabulary of grief that did not belong to their calendars. They practiced breathing until breath became less like a tool and more like a homecoming. Sophia led them through the journaling prompts. Name the sensation, place it on a scale, write what the body asked for. They were deliberate about boundaries.
Noor was Gizan 19, with a web of bruises on her forearms that suggested too many nights awake. She lay on a gurney, lashes closed, then opened and spoke of a street she had never walked and a sea that had the wrong smell. Her parents recited ordinary biographical facts, school, job, no history of psychosis, but their faces betrayed the admission that the atlas had rearranged certainties. The ER placed a monitor on Noor's chest and kept her in a quiet room, and a doctor in scrubs who smelled faintly of disinfectant and tea asked Sophia what she could do. "What we can do," Sophia said, "is sit with her body, document what she reports, and make sure any intervention honors consent. We can offer grounding. We can note the timeline." The doctor nodded, but her hands hovered over a tablet that wanted to convert the human into checkboxes. She asked whether there had been any physical seizures, any fever. She typed in "dissociative episode" with the clinical care of someone who knows the 1,000 diagnostic words and keeps them lined up like soldiers. Documentation became, for a moment, a contest of faiths. The ER favored firm labels and urgent protocols. Sophia argued for descriptions that would travel with Noor, what she said, when she said it, how her skin sounded in the clinician's hands, so that future clinicians, researchers, or helpers would be able to reconstruct a path without flattening the person. They negotiated, slowly and sometimes brusquely, until the ER agreed to a shared note: clinical observations plus a safe report that could be used for both care and study. Back at the clinic that night, the lamp following them like a promise, Sophia and Marcos catalogued what they had learned. Noor's experience fit the contours of what the workshop had revealed: sensory availabilities,
old memories colliding with the present, shock that could be managed if the body were attended to first. They added a new bullet point to the protocol. Always assess physical safety first. Always ask for consent before any intervention that could erase testimony. They updated the e-book draft accordingly and added a carefully worded paragraph about how to talk to emergency rooms, scripts for relatives, what to insist upon, what to refuse politely. Their inboxes, meanwhile, did not sleep. Messages arrived with the kind of velocity that makes the morning inbox feel like a different country. An inquiry from a local university proposing a study. An invitation to a TV morning show that wanted a demystified segment. A private note from a friend who said she'd seen online groups offering pills to stabilize the experience. Someone from a municipal health office asked for a meeting. The tone was deferential, but there was an undercurrent of bureaucratic hunger, an impulse to make the event legible and therefore controllable. Sophia read and replied with care. She declined the TV show.
She answered the university with a set of conditions: community consent, shared authorship, access to findings for the neighborhoods most affected. She wrote no reply yet to the municipal note. That night the sky brightened, not in a theatrical way, but as if a thin cord had been plucked and held, a long, low vibration that threaded through windows and under doors. It made the radiator hum, made a sleeping dog lift its head, made the city breathe as if remembering an ocean. "It's getting closer," Marcos said. There was no triumph in the words, no dread either, only a practical recognition of time compressing. Sophia closed her laptop and ran a finger along the spine of the printed consent forms. She thought about the 10 people in the circle and how they had left carrying small liturgies of care. Outside, from the direction of the river, someone sounded a horn, an old, plaintive note that answered the sky's longer chord. Across town, a different sound rose, a shout, someone naming a memory aloud on a stoop, the way people sometimes do when they cannot bear to keep a thing inside. The atlas was no longer a distant signal. It had become a shared pulse that would ask communities, institutions, and individuals what they intended to do with the knowledge it pressed into their palms. Sophia and Marcos read the messages until the words blurred, then stopped and listened instead. The vibration in the air deepened, not loud but certain, as if a new instrument had been added to the world's weather. Someone across the city laughed, then sobbed. The lamp on Sophia's kitchen table cast a small island of light. The rest of the apartment felt as if it had been washed in thin color. "We teach them to come back to their bodies," Sophia repeated, not as a plan, but as a vow. There were so many ways to fail that vow, and so many ways to keep it. She imagined the scaffold she had sketched in the notebook expanding like a net, 10 to 10 to 10, catching moments that otherwise would have fallen through. But she also imagined other nets, nets of classification, nets of commerce, nets of policy. The atlas, indifferent to human categories, would not choose for them. It would only press questions into the world and wait. A new message pinged. It was short and unsigned, a photograph of the sky from across town, where the blue-gold streak had multiplied into a lattice, each thread pulsing in a slow, deliberate rhythm. Someone had circled a shape in the photograph and written, in block letters, "It listens." The phone on the kitchen counter buzzed again, this time with a notification from a neighborhood listserv.
An emergency meeting at the community center in 2 hours. The organizers wanted to coordinate volunteer responders. Sophia looked at Marcos. He had already stood and was pulling on his jacket. "We go," he said. Outside, the city's pulse seemed to swell like a held note. It felt like friction against the kind of grassroots, neighbor-to-neighbor care Sophia believed might make the difference. She folded the phone into her palm and then stepped forward to speak, because someone had to translate the tension between institutional caution and community urgency into a plan that would not abandon either. Her voice moved through the center with the steady cadence of someone who had spent a long time learning to ask the right question. Not what is the Atlas, but what do we do now with what it leaves in us? Outside, the sky pulsed, and a new, higher note threaded through the low chord, small as a bird and precise as a compass. The city inhaled. People answered in the only way they could, by turning toward one another. Sophia's hand hesitated only a beat over the whiteboard, then moved to divide the page into quadrants. "We'll translate those into actions," she said, voice steady enough to keep a wobble from spreading. "Consent means we ask before we do anything, no exceptions. Safety means physical and emotional protocols. Record means we document what happens, where, and who was present. Teach means short, repeatable lessons people can learn in 10 minutes. A murmur of agreement, a few raised eyebrows. The woman with the county badge folded her arms. "Documentation will make us liable," she said. "And the advisory. If the city's telling people to avoid gatherings, we need sanctioned spaces, not improvised ones." Marcos stepped forward then, moving as if into a role he had not planned to take. Hands coated in the practical calm of someone who had built things with his own hands. "We can use thresholds," he suggested. "Apartment lobbies, hallways, stairwells. Spaces that are technically not gatherings because they're site-based support, short, staggered. We train volunteers tonight to do 2-minute checks, grounding, then pass the log to a central secure server." He glanced at Sophia. "We'll make the reporting anonymous where requested." Someone called out a question about translators. Sophia signaled to a young man near the back who had been handing out flyers. "We'll have multilingual sheets," she said. "Pictures of techniques, short scripts, and consent statements printed in the top languages of the neighborhood. No one should have to sign anything that looks like a legal trap, only a clear yes or no." A woman near the doorway touched her temple and frowned. "But what if someone starts to sing and doesn't stop? What if—" Her voice trailed into a rawness the group could recognize. Fear laid against the unknown. At that moment, the Atlas shifted again. The high note threaded through the center like someone running a fingertip across crystal. The lights dimmed a fraction. Breath paused. Without thinking, a volunteer tapped his phone screen and aimed the camera, then lowered it as a reflex of protection and of curiosity. A hush rolled in after the tone, like the fallout of a held chord.
Outside, Watla swelled into a new chord, not threatening so much as patient, an enormous instrument that seemed to be testing the city's harmonies. Sophia felt the responsibility sharpen to the point of a decision. This would not be a single night. It would be work stretched over weeks, like mending a frayed fabric with careful loops. The choice to care could ripple. It could also be swallowed by fear. She turned to Marcos. "Can you run logistics, start a roster?" she asked. He nodded, jaw set. "I'll get the volunteers grouped by building," he said. "And I'll rig the messaging. Short,
clear how to consent, where to call. A pair of teenagers who had been passing out water raised their hands. "We can do runs," one said. "We know the buildings. We can bring blankets, phones, chargers." The room filled with small agreements, the kind that builds scaffolds under chaos. The atlas outside threaded a phrase through the air, a cadence neither wholly human nor wholly alien. It sang, and the city answered by finding its way into itself, door to door, voice to hand. Sophia felt the lamp in their apartment, the small witness they had left burning. She imagined 100 such lamps, tiny beacons against the frequency. For now, for tonight, that had to be enough. She wrote one last box on the whiteboard, in capitals that seemed to slow the pulse of the room. Scale with consent. Then she led the first of the training circles, her voice low, instructive, and patient. And the people in the room learned in 10 minutes how to steady another human being when everything outside leaned toward a new, unnameable singing. They practiced the breath and the questions, and they folded those actions into their hands like tools. Beyond the windows, the city breathed, and the atlas hummed on. Within the center, a network of small, deliberate choices began to stitch itself along streets and stairwells, fragile, resolute, human. The night was still young, and the work had only begun.